One second you are completely fine, going about your ordinary day without a single worry. The next second, without any warning at all, you're 5 years old again, flooded instantly with shame, terror, or a crushing sense of complete worthlessness, even though absolutely nothing dangerous just actually happened around you. No memory ever played in your mind. No image appeared at all. Just the raw feeling itself, hitting you like a sudden wave, completely out of nowhere. Psychologists have a clear name for this specific experience, and once you truly and fully understand it, you may finally understand years of confusing reactions that never quite made sense before. This is called an emotional flashback, a specific technical term first coined by psychotherapist Pete Walker while working extensively for many years with survivors of childhood trauma and complex post-traumatic stress. Unlike the flashbacks most people picture, the kind with vivid pictures, sounds, or full scenes replaying like a movie, an emotional flashback carries no images at all. There is simply the emotion itself, sudden and overwhelming, as though your nervous system briefly traveled backward in time to a moment when you were genuinely unsafe, even though your conscious mind has no clear memory attached to the feeling whatsoever. Here is what makes this so disorienting. During ordinary childhood development, difficult emotional experiences are supposed to get processed, labeled, and eventually filed away as memories your brain can consciously access later in life. But when a child experiences repeated fear, neglect, criticism, or instability, particularly from the very caregivers they depend on for basic safety, the brain often cannot fully process those emotions at the time. Instead, the raw feeling gets stored implicitly, meaning it lives in the body and nervous system rather than as a clear, narrative memory you can consciously recall on demand whenever you choose. Years later, something completely ordinary can trigger that stored feeling. A certain tone of voice that faintly resembles a parent's, being ignored in a group conversation, receiving mild criticism at work, or even someone simply walking away mid-conversation. To the adult brain, none of this looks remotely dangerous. But to the deeper, more primitive parts of the nervous system responsible for detecting threat, the emotional pattern matches something that once meant real danger, and it responds accordingly, instantly and involuntarily, often within a fraction of a second. Pete Walker described 4 common ways people react during an emotional flashback, based on the classic survival responses fight, flight, freeze, and a lesser-known but equally important 4th response he called Fawn. In fight mode, a person might suddenly feel intense irritability, defensiveness, or a controlling urge to argue their point aggressively, often catching themselves and others completely off guard. In flight mode, a person might feel a sudden desperate urge to physically leave the room, end a conversation abruptly, or bury themselves frantically in work or some other distracting task. In freeze mode, the person goes numb, mentally checks out, and struggles to speak or even think clearly for several minutes. And in fawn mode, the person immediately shifts into people-pleasing, over-apologizing, or scrambling to fix the situation, even when they were not actually at fault for anything at all. What makes emotional flashbacks especially confusing is that the person experiencing one is rarely able to identify what is actually happening in the moment. Because there is no visual memory attached to the feeling, it simply feels like an appropriate, real-time reaction to whatever is currently happening. A person might insist their anger, panic, or shame is entirely about the present situation, when in reality, the emotional intensity is coming almost entirely from an old, unresolved wound. The conscious mind never actually got the chance to fully process and heal. Research into complex trauma has found that the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection center, can become highly sensitized after repeated early adversity, essentially lowering its threshold for what counts as a genuine threat. At the same time, the hippocampus, which is responsible for properly time-stamping memories and clearly distinguishing between past and present, can also be affected by chronic early stress. This combination helps explain why an emotional flashback can feel so completely convincing and so intensely present tense, even though the actual danger that originally created the pattern is long over and objectively gone. It helps to see how this actually plays out in ordinary daily life. Imagine an employee who receives a perfectly reasonable piece of constructive feedback from a manager during a routine meeting. Within seconds, their chest tightens, their face flushes with heat, and a wave of shame washes over them so intensely that they can barely focus on the rest of what is being said. Later that day, they cannot fully explain why such a minor comment hit them so hard. For someone who grew up being harshly criticized or punished for small mistakes as a child, that exact tone of gentle correction can unconsciously trigger the same nervous system response that once protected them from a much harsher and a more frightening reality. The feedback itself was harmless. The nervous system, however, did not get that message in time. It is also worth clearly distinguishing emotional flashbacks from the flashbacks typically associated with standard post-traumatic stress disorder. A classic PTSD flashback, often triggered by a single identifiable traumatic event such as an accident, an assault, or combat exposure, usually comes with vivid sensory detail, specific sounds, images, and a strong felt sense of reliving the actual event itself in real time. Emotional flashbacks, by contrast, are far more commonly associated with complex trauma, meaning repeated, chronic experiences that unfolded gradually over months or even years, especially during childhood. Because the original experience was ongoing rather than a single isolated incident, there's often no single dramatic memory to point back to, only the diffuse, deeply familiar feeling itself, which can make the entire experience even harder for a person to consciously recognize, name, and eventually explain to themselves or to others. So how do people actually begin working through this pattern? Therapists who specialize in complex trauma often recommend a technique, sometimes called simply naming it. The moment someone notices a sudden, disproportionately intense emotional reaction, they gently pause and consciously ask themselves a simple question. How old do I feel right now, in this exact moment? Just consciously identifying an emotional flashback clearly as it happens, rather than being completely and helplessly swept away by it without any awareness at all, can meaningfully begin to shorten its overall duration and considerably reduce its emotional intensity over time. Grounding techniques also help considerably. Simple physical actions like firmly pressing your feet flat into the floor, taking several slow, deliberate breaths, or naming 5 things you can currently see in the room around you, all help gently signal to a hyper-aroused nervous system that the present moment truly is safe, even though the emotional part of the brain is still convinced otherwise in that instant. Over time, and often with real professional support, people can gradually learn to recognize their own personal patterns of triggers, catch a flashback earlier and earlier as it begins to build, and respond with self-compassion instead of confusion, self-blame, or harsh self-criticism. Clinicians also emphasize the importance of separating the intensity of a feeling from its accuracy as information about the present moment. A feeling can be completely genuine and, at the exact same time, be responding primarily to the past rather than to whatever is actually happening right now. Learning to hold both of those truths simultaneously without dismissing the emotion entirely or being fully controlled by it either tends to be one of the single most difficult and most valuable skills that people recovering from complex trauma gradually develop over months and years of consistent, patient practice. Understanding emotional flashbacks does not mean every strong feeling you ever have is automatically some sort of unresolved childhood wound resurfacing. Sometimes anger is simply appropriate anger, and sadness is simply appropriate sadness given the actual present-day situation. But for many people who grew up in chaotic, critical, or emotionally unpredictable environments, recognizing this specific pattern can be genuinely life-changing. It offers a clear, workable explanation for reactions that once felt completely irrational, and, more importantly, it also offers a clear, practical, and deeply hopeful path towards finally responding to daily life from the actual present moment, rather than unconsciously reacting from the past. If any part of this describes something you personally have felt before, but never quite had the right words for, hit like, share this with someone who might need to hear today, and subscribe now for more real psychology explained clearly and compassionately.